in the media, they were relying on exit polling to determine how many Muslims voted this way versus that way. And we actually have the data to show how Muslims voted. So what we see in this poll is that Muslims in the United States, their votes are really up for grabs.
This is Deep Dives by ISPU, a podcast by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. We explore cutting edge research and data about issues shaping American Muslim communities, featuring leading scholars, advocates, and thinkers from across the country.
Contrary to what we saw in the exit polling, we show that actually that was where the majority of Muslims voted was actually for the Democratic presidential candidate. 31% voted for Trump. That's less than the general population. More in the general population voted for Trump than within the Muslim community. Where Muslims diverged from the general population most significantly is we had more of them voting for a third party, Jill Stein.
That was Saher Selod, ISPU's Director of Research, co primary investigator, and report co author of American Muslim Poll 2025. Muslims made headlines after the 2024 presidential election, as commentators and analysts tried to make sense of their role in shaping the outcome. But ISPU's American Muslim Poll 2025 goes deeper than the headlines, offering a clear, data driven picture of how American Muslims are thinking, voting, and engaging with the world around them. This year's findings reveal a community deeply engaged, increasingly diverse, and more politically independent than ever before. Despite rising Islamophobia and an exhausting election cycle, Muslims across the country continue to organize, advocate, and show up in ways that go far beyond the ballot box. We're also joined by Tuqa Nusairat, ISPU's Executive Director, who helps connect the data to the lived experiences and needs of the community. Together, Tuqa and Saher unpack what the American Muslim Poll 2025 adds to nearly a decade of research by ISPU and to the evolving story of American Muslims in public life.
ISPU does something that, as an academic who has been studying Muslims in the United States for well over a decade, it offers data on American Muslims, something that not many other or any other really research organization does. We do have Pew that puts out a survey of Muslims, but it doesn't come out every few years like the American Muslim Poll does. So this is a one of a kind survey which provides rigorous research on Muslims in the United States. So one of the examples that I can provide you of how ISPU is different from any other survey that exists on Muslims in the United States is that we actually distinguish in this survey between Arab Muslims and white Muslims. According to the US Census, Arabs have been racially classified as white in the United States, and we actually ask participants if they identify as white or if they identify as Arab. So we're able to really provide more nuanced, detailed information about Muslims in the United States based on race, based on ethnicity, gender. Another thing that ISPU does is, well, we ask a lot of questions about civic engagement, political participation, voter trends for Muslims, and we're able to compare them across other religious groups. We are also an organization that listens to the community. And so on our surveys, we are always listening to what the community needs, the American Muslim community needs, and provide questions and data based on those needs. Yeah, and I just want to add one other thing that's really important. A lot of people do survey Muslims in the United States, so advocacy organizations might survey an American Muslim population for various reasons. The difference between our research is that it's really an academic project. So it undergoes the utmost rigor and standards within academic research. So that's also something that's really important to point out about ISPU's poll.
Just to kind of piggyback off of what you were saying, Sahar, I think what's really important is to emphasize the point that this survey is conducted in a way that is directly tied to the needs of the Muslim community in a way that others are not. They may be trying to serve a bigger audience that is looking to see how, for example, how American Muslims fit in American society or how relevant they are for a specific election, for example. Whereas our survey is constantly evolving to meet the needs of the community. So when we did the poll in 2019 or 2020, amidst the pandemic, it was something that, obviously that was a major driving theme of the poll. And so we change some of the questions and we keep some the same so that we're able to monitor the trends and we're able to meet the needs of the community at any given time. And obviously, the community has been through a lot since we have done the last poll in 2022, and you'll see a lot of that data come through the questions that we posed to our respondents.
What makes the American Muslim poll so powerful isn't just how it's conducted, it's what it reveals. Each year, the data gives us a clearer picture of how Muslims in America are experiencing and responding to the world around them. So, what stood out in 2025, and what new stories did the numbers tell this time?
I think that one of the most important findings that, you know, we saw a lot of media attention around was how Muslims were going to vote in the 2024 presidential election. And we actually, so in the media, they were relying on exit polling to determine how many Muslims voted this way versus that way. And we actually have the data to show how Muslims voted. So what we see in this poll is that Muslims in the United States, their votes are really up for grabs. After 9/11, we knew that prior to 9/11, that, a significant portion of the Muslim population voted for a Republican presidential candidate, that being Bush. Not all, but a significant portion, and we can talk about the nuance in terms of race and ethnicity. However, in this last election, what we see is that while the majority of Muslims voted for Biden in 2020, that there was a decrease in the number of Muslims who voted for Biden. So Muslim votes are really up for grabs. It's based on policy, the war in Gaza, the genocide. Those are really important policy priorities for Muslims. So they're going to vote based on their policy priorities, and they're less committed to a particular party in terms of the presidential election. Um, a couple other points that I thought stood out were that Muslims are most likely to face obstacles voting compared to other religious groups. The Islamophobia index jumped significantly. So we saw across all religious groups, except for Muslims and actually Jews, that they had jumped on the Islamophobia index, meaning that they had sort of agreed with these Islamophobic tropes that we asked them about. Um, Also, that there was minimal support for displacement of Palestinians from Gaza from all religious groups. So, regardless of if they were Catholic or Protestant or Jewish, most religious groups, there was not a lot of support for the displacement of Palestinians from Gaza. And then the last one that I think really stands out for me is that half of Muslim families reported having a child being bullied in school. I think these are important data points to think about.
In the aftermath of the 2024 election, Muslim voters made national headlines. From the uncommitted movement that organized a call for a ceasefire in Gaza to debates about whether Muslims swayed the outcome, everyone seemed to have a theory, but few had the facts. We turn back to Tuqa and Saher as they break down what the data tells us about Muslim voters, not as a monolith, but as a growing, diverse, and politically independent community shaping the country's future.
To put this in perspective, Muslims make up a very tiny percentage of the US population. We don't have the exact numbers, but we're looking at most 2%, between 1 to 2% of the US population. It is growing, but it's a very small percentage of the United States population. However, I think the reason Muslims got so much attention, not just because of the uncommitted movement that we saw as a result of wanting to pressure the presidential candidates into demanding a ceasefire in Palestine, that Muslims in swing states are large enough to have determined the outcome of an election. So, to put it in context, when Biden won in 2020, he won Georgia by 12,000 votes. More than 61,000 Muslims in Georgia showed up to the polls. So while Muslims are a very small percentage of the US population, they exist and are voting in these states that are really, there that were very narrowly won by Biden and very narrowly won by Trump. If you look at the data in terms of how many votes he won states like Pennsylvania by. So the thing is in this last election, Trump won all of these swing states, not just the few where we see a concentration of Muslims like in Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, for example. So that's why Muslims, wield some power, even though they're a small percentage of the overall population, is because they're concentrated in these places where these states have been narrowly won by a Democratic or a Republican candidate. And what our data really highlights is that voter registration for Muslims is increasing. More Muslims are running for office than ever before. I think CARE came out with a number of 250 some elected Muslim officials. So we have a small population, but they're getting more engaged both civically and politically.
I think it's really important that our poll highlights the diversity within the Muslim community of different policy priorities. And so while other polls or surveys may group Muslims under one umbrella, we really take a deep dive into the ethnic breakdown, the gender breakdown, the age breakdown of our community and their policy priorities. So we've seen, for example, that for the war in Gaza was a top priority for Asian Muslims, whereas the economy and job creation and healthcare ranked higher for Black Muslims. And this is important to note because it reflects the lived experience and the diversity within the Muslim community of Black Americans, Asian Muslim Americans, white Muslim Americans, and it emphasizes the fact that they can't be painted with a broad brush. Where they live, which state they reside in, what their socioeconomic status is, really determines and drives their vote, whether it's on the federal level or on the local level. And so we want to bring as much nuance to the conversation about American Muslims as possible through this poll and through our survey questions.
Yeah, and I'm just going to add to that. Thank you, Tuka, for that. You know, what we saw was a movement and a unifying issue for Muslims that we hadn't seen in years past, So really, Muslims were coming together to demand a ceasefire and saying, we're going to withhold our votes if you don't, the candidate who comes through with this is the one we're going to support. And then after Harris became the candidate and Biden dropped out, what we saw after that was kind of a splintering amongst Muslims, with a lot of, not all, but a lot of African American Muslims and many prominent ones saying, we are going to support her because a lot of these issues really matter to our community and have always mattered to our community. So, the economy, healthcare, education, things that we start to see if we're looking at Muslims, in a nuanced way, that we're not all impacted by the same issues and we're not organizing around the same issues. And so that sort of splintered that moment of people coming together. So we're able to actually provide that as Tuqa said, and I think that's very important for anyone to think about when they're you can't paint us with one broad stroke. We are very diverse, socioeconomically, racially, ethnically, and in our beliefs. I think to the other question, if I can just add that contrary to what we saw in the exit polling, we show that actually that was where the majority of Muslims voted was actually for the Democratic presidential candidate. 31% voted for Trump. That's less than the general population. More in the general population voted for Trump than within the Muslim community. Where Muslims diverged from the general population most significantly is we had more of them voting for a third party, Jill Stein. And that was, that's a much lower number at 12%. So the majority of American Muslims actually did vote for the Democratic presidential candidate. So it's kind of, dispelling those myths that we cost the election, that the election went to Trump because of Muslims. It's just not true. But I don't want to discount that 31%. That's a pretty large percentage, but it's on trend with how they voted in 2020 and before. So that's something that I think that this data helps to sort of clarify these myths that Muslims are responsible for anyone being president of the United States right now.
Even with record civic participation, many Muslims are questioning what that participation actually delivers. Our poll shows that 85% of Muslims who are legally eligible to vote are registered, up from 60% in 2016, a steady rise that points to growing political engagement across the community. After an election that left parts of the community frustrated and divided, how much faith do Muslim voters still have in a two-party system? And what does the data really say about the growing sense of disillusionment, if there is any?
My 2 cents on this, and Tuqa, you might see this differently because we're really looking through the data and reading the data. What does it say? To me, when I think about disillusionment in a two-party system, it's for multiple reasons. And, people who are advocating for a third party really because their values aren't represented within this two-party system. I'm not sure that I think Muslims, I don't know that I read it that way exactly. I think what I see in the data is that Muslims are not being heard or being like our presidential candidates at least are not considering what Muslims are asking for or what their policy priorities are. So to me, it feels like Muslims are less like migrating, even though we have that 12% voting for Jill Stein in this election. I think that's unusual because of the genocide, the ongoing genocide. But I think what it is that Muslims are sort of saying, well, here are my policy priorities and I'm not tied to you. And some of that is because of what those policy priorities really are. So if we look at like Muslim Harris voters compared to the general public Harris voters, they're somewhat aligned, but it's actually the people who voted for Muslim Jill Stein voters who are more aligned with the general public Harris voters. So I think it's Muslims are when I said they're up for grabs, I think that, if you're meeting the needs of Muslims, then I think that you can, they're not abandoning necessarily the two-party system, but I think that, you know, there is the potential for a Republican candidate who is not espousing Islamophobia at the level that we've seen in the past few elections to potentially win over Muslim voters. So I don't think the data shows that Muslims are necessarily progressive in wanting to, move towards a third party candidate. And the other thing that I want to add is particularly in this last election, Islamophobia was skyrocketing, and it was under a Biden administration. It wasn't under a Trump administration. So I think when Muslims are saying, okay, well, I'm going to experience Islamophobia under a under a Democratic administration, and a Republican administration is campaigning on Islamophobia, like, is either party really meeting, concerned about our needs? So I don't know, Tuka, what do you think?
I think um, there was enough distrust of the two parties and their representatives on the issues that matter to Muslim Americans that there was a vacuum that was filled by the third party and that was able to be tapped into. I, I think in the aftermath of the election, you don't see people in our community organizing for the third party at this point. They've forgotten that they voted 12% of them for a third party. And in fact, they're trying to figure out ways that they could make better inroads and have more impact uh, within the two parties that are obviously the most relevant for our political system. So I think they're disillusioned with politicians, with their policies, and with the whole system when it came to the genocide in Gaza. That whether we boycotted, it didn't matter. Whether we engaged internally, it didn't matter. We tried everything. And so, this was kind of a protest vote, I guess you could say. But I don't think that the American Muslim community in the aftermath of what happened in November is flocking to the third party. I think that they're flocking to ways that they can have more influence and advance the issues that matter to them with either party. I think the realization is that there's no party that is loyal to us or that we should be loyal to, and that we should be driven by the issues for the most part.
Even amid rising Islamophobia and frustration with the political system, one theme runs consistently through ISPU's data: Muslims continue to engage. From record voter registration to increased organizing, advocacy, and public service, civic participation remains a defining part of this story. But beyond the numbers, the question is, how can this data be used? How do researchers, journalists, educators, and policymakers take these findings and translate them into action to inform smarter coverage, create better policy, and ensure more equitable representation?
We have the data in AMP, but anecdotally from what we have seen over the past 2 years as well, is obviously this issue of what's happening in Gaza has been something that has really touched American Muslims in a way that it hasn't done so before. A lot of it is tied to how we as American taxpayers are contributing to the genocide directly. And so there's a direct line between engaging your congressman or your senator on, what funding, Israel gets to be able to continue what it's doing to the Palestinians and the Gazans in particular. So I think that that's, a major driver, but I also think it came at a time where the Muslim community has matured significantly in terms of its civic engagement work. And that's a good thing that it came at a time where people had already have some of the background on how to engage with their members of Congress, on attending town halls. We had a jump in Muslims who are running for office. So those two things coincided to create this, formula that allowed more people to be engaged on many different fronts.
Yeah, and I'm just also going to add that the continued rise in Islamophobia and experiences with discrimination has also played a role in Muslim engagement. I think that, we saw the biggest spike in Muslims running for office in 2018, I believe, and that was coming off of Trump's first term in office. And so, we saw a lot of people, a lot of women, even, non-Muslim, but just women running for office because of, threats that people were facing. So, this is something that we're going to see a shift, and I think we'll continue to see increased civic engagement. We have more organizations that are, Muslim civic organizations in this country. We have Muslim advocacy organizations way more than after 9/11. And we have a young Muslim population. We have the highest percentage of a population that's between the ages of 18 and 24. And so these young people are going to grow up with these organizations, with the Get Out the Vote, campaign, with more Muslim elected officials, with more opportunities to intern with an elected official. So, I think that we're only going to see this continue, and it's just been on the rise. After 9/11, we had fewer organizations to deal with the aftermath of 9/11, and now we have so many more. And then the last thing that I want to say about that is some people might view the uncommitted movement as disengagement. It's actually quite the opposite. It mobilized people, like Tuqa said, to contact their state official, their senator, to demand a ceasefire. That's something that, we saw so many people calling to demand a ceasefire, and many, many Muslims across the country. So it really was unifying and getting Muslims to engage with their elected officials when perhaps they hadn't done so at quite this level.
I'll let Sahar get into the specifics, but there was one point that stood out to me when you asked this question, which is how diverse the Muslim community is in terms of gender and age and racial and ethnic breakdown. I think it's interesting to see how the news media is covering the policy priorities and the engagement of the Jewish community with regards to what's happening in the genocide in Gaza, and how the younger Jewish community, the more progressive Jewish community members are showing significant opposition to US policy towards Israel. And so they are going, within that religious community and kind of breaking it down by a number of different factors. So there's a way to bring nuance to a conversation about a religious community. We're seeing that happen right now. And I think the same can be done for the Muslim community. And that will be much more informative for everybody, policymakers, civic organizations, and many others.
Yeah, and I also think we need to consider if, you know, some of the data points that we have are about student experiences, which will come out in our forthcoming reports. It's not in this the report that we're releasing in October, but the fact that we have a high percent, 26% of Muslims are between the ages of 18 and 24, helps us understand what's happening on college campuses, for example. The fact that students are reporting higher levels of discrimination, or have in the last 2 years, because of what's happening in Palestine, and the pressure to silence speech around this on college campuses. So it's important that that policymakers, that journalists, again, stop flattening us as if we're one, we're all one type. We're not. We're diverse. We're younger. They're younger Muslims. And then also, to Tuka's point about gender, I mean, another really important finding from poll is that for Muslim Trump voters, they're overwhelmingly Muslim men, and not Muslim women. So, there's a lot to be said about like Muslim women and how Muslim women feel about like what their policy priorities are, who they're voting for. I think if being from academia, if you study any social movement, you know that women were often the ones who were the organizers, even with, Black Lives Matter in this country. Yeah, we don't dig deep enough into these really important nuances about age, gender, and racial and ethnic diversity. They're all very important to understand our community.
So one of the most important things that the American Muslim poll provides is data that is very useful for our own organizations that are out there in the field, whether they're addressing mental health or education and bullying of students in school, or, obviously addressing civic engagement issues. We want to make sure that their strategies and their programming are informed by what is actually happening in our community. And we hear this all the time. Thank you so much. They're coming to us and saying, thank you for providing this data. We thought it was this way, and now we're kind of adjusting to this, or we know this anecdotally, but in order to talk to a representative or this school board official or to advocate on this issue, we really needed the data. And that's one of the many ways that people within the Muslim community are using it. Of course, outside of the Muslim community, there are a number of categories of individuals that have been able to use the American Muslim poll. I'll let Sahar elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think just to give an example, Elizabeth Warren using, data from a past poll on banking while Muslim. That's important. It has a massive impact on an American Muslim population who experiences discrimination regularly while banking. And so we were able to provide data that was useful to a senator in my state of Massachusetts, to, try to combat these, discriminatory practices. So, we want to put this data in the right hands so that it's useful to reduce discrimination of Muslims, make sure that Muslims are treated with equality in this country. Another example that, of a, a group that could use this data and take a look at it are journalists. And one of the things that I experienced after the last presidential election was I was hearing from my non-Muslim friends that, they thought Muslims were to blame for the outcome of this election. And that's because that's all they heard from the American mainstream media was that Dearborn, Michigan did this. Well, Dearborn, Michigan has a significant Muslim population, but that is not where all Muslims in the United States reside. We exist in all states in this country. And so our data actually shows that what the media presents on us is not the full picture. And it's actually not accurate because, as we show, 50% of Muslims voted for Kamala Harris. So we want to see journalists, policymakers use this data, this data that's nuanced to stop, providing a reductionist picture of American Muslims in the United States.
Over the past decade, the American Muslim poll has helped tell a different kind of story, one grounded in facts, but powered by people. It's a reminder that behind every number is a lived experience, a family, a student, a voter, a neighbor. The 2025 poll adds another chapter to that story, one of resilience, diversity, and a community finding new ways to be seen and heard. To dive deeper, visit ispu.org/poll to explore the full American Muslim Poll 2025 report. And if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe and leave us a review. You can also follow ISPU on X and Facebook at the ISPU and on Instagram at _ISPU for updates and more stories like this. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.